of you have been to our classes before? Ooh, well, that's really nice. Well, welcome to those that have been here before, and welcome to those that this is your first class. We hope you enjoy it. And again, in your packet of information, you will have all of these slides, so don't feel like you have to write a bunch of information down. You will also have the recipes that you're provided here, as well as some extra recipes to try at home. You have your class schedule. You have a $2 off coupon to Harvest. If you haven't been here before for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, we highly encourage that. And then you also have a class evaluation, which really helps us in planning our next cycle of classes. So any ideas that you put down, anything you want to see, we really do read that and take that into consideration. So we aim to please. All right, so we're gonna get started. How many of you have a crock pot at home? Perfect, I'm assuming that's why you're here. So it's a wonderful, versatile piece of equipment. It lasts a long time too. I know I've had mine for ages. So what we're gonna talk about is we're gonna talk about some tips for using your crock pot, some tricks, some fixes if something doesn't turn out quite the way you planned, and then some ideas, maybe thinking a little bit outside the box of what you normally put in your crock pot. So to start with, you want to make sure that your crock pot is working correctly. And when I mean working correctly, I mean, is it going to get to the right temperature? So checking your crock pot temperature. You can do that by putting 2 quarts of water in your crock pot, cover it, and heat it on low for 8 hours. If you have a new crock pot, chances are that it's working just fine. So maybe do this for some of your older crock pots. Then you lift the lid, check the temperature right away with a thermometer, and it should read between 180 to 200 degrees. So if it's higher than 200 degrees, your food may overcook, and if it's lower than 180 degrees, the crock pot most likely is not working correctly, so your food won't get to the proper temperature. So, and we do worry about food safety, of course. So you might be aware that crock pots come in all different sizes. And some are used for certain things and some are used for other things. So like you have small crock pots that might be used for sauces. You have larger crock pots which may be used for a complete meal. So sometimes it's great to have different sizes that you can play around with. So they range from 1 quart to 8.5 quarts. 1 to 3 quarts is usually sufficient if your recipe is feeding 1 to 2 people. So the model number on the bottom of the base will tell you the size of the stoneware. So this is for the crock pot specific brand. So the 400 model is 4 quarts. But of course, if you're buying it, it'll say it on the box what its capacity is. So just in case you're wondering. So for temperatures, low is about 180 to 200 degrees. High is over 300 degrees. 1 hour on high is about 2 to 2.5 hours on low. So that's a little bit of conversion there. And a lot of recipes just have you put it on low for 8 to 10 hours. Because for most of us, we like to set our crock pot, leave, go to work, and then have the food ready by the time we come home, which is typically 8 to 10 hours. So preheating can take 20 minutes for the base to warm up. To be aware of that. First up, right. I have a cider. This is from the crock pot, the main brand recipe. That's just, I think, if you're looking at the quality of your food, you have it already preheated, warmed, ready to go when you put the items in. That means it will start cooking immediately. Whereas if you put it into a cold or room temperature base, it takes a little bit to warm up, so your food might be sitting there at an undesirable temperature. So, and then filling at least half full, but no more than 3/4 full. I think I've been guilty of this, filling it to the top of the lid with items, and then it does not cook thoroughly or properly all the way through. And if you don't have it full enough, then your items are going to get dry and overcooked. Just another little tip, we'll talk more about the different food groups and tips later on, but removing visible fat from meat and skin from the poultry first. And that's not only because you're removing fat, which makes it healthier, but the fat melts and layers the top of the food, causing it sort of as an insulation. Fat insulates us, so it'll insulate your food as well. So then it's more likely to overcook or make it a mushy texture. So Some other tips when preparing a roast or a meatloaf. You can use handles. You can make your own handles if you want to lift it out just by folding tin foil so that it makes 2 strips, and then you put that under and you pull it up. And that way you can get your meat out. Or if you have turkey forks too, like you would at Thanksgiving, you can use that to get your meat out. If something calls for milk, you can use evaporated milk if you want a creamier consistency. Another tip, don't remove the lid during the first at least 3/4 of cooking time. You shouldn't have to stir any of the items in your crock pot unless the recipe specifically tells you to stir it. Otherwise, the more you remove the lid and look at it, the more you're letting the heat escape, and then that changes the cooking or the quality of the food. And then once the food is cooked, don't store it in the crock pot liner. So if you want, it won't cool down fast enough. So then again, you risk food safety issues. So you can remove it from the crock pot itself and let it cool off that way. And this is a little bit about converting crock pot like on the stove versus the low cooking time versus the high cooking time. So if you're used to making some particular item on the oven or the stove top, 15 to 30 minutes there would be 4 to 6 hours low, and 1.5 to 2.5 hours on high. We'll come back to this, but which recipe would you like to do?
I have granola on the front, but I'm going to wait to do that one. The second one on the back of that is the turkey enchilada quinoa. I'd like to talk about it and serve it up right away because that's something that could overcook if it keeps sitting in the crock pot. So I'd like to get it to you as fast as possible.
And it's nice using the quinoa. I mean, I know you can use rice, certainly, but quinoa is a whole grain. It's gluten-free. Rice is as well. Whole grain. It's just kind of a different option. It gives it a little bit different texture. Most grains are going to be low fat, lower in calories, good fiber, and it wins because quinoa has more protein than you would other grains. So,
is everyone okay with cheddar cheese and cilantro on top? No one has objects? Okay. So yes, this class, it's a little different for me compared to the other ones I've done because I have, obviously I have the dietitian. Usually she's not in my holiday class. But also, it's kind of hard for me to demo a lot of these things because I try to stick to recipes that would pretty much be like one-pot wonders. So I'll still kind of walk you through what to do with these. But do you want to just top maybe? Or do you want to scoop?
I can scoop.
Okay. Yeah, just scoop it.
Scoop
some on there. So if you notice on the recipe, I said to cook the turkey first. I just did a regular plain ground turkey. I just seasoned it with salt and pepper, and you can do a good amount. And just cooked it in a little bit of oil. Yeah, that's fine. That's fine.
Was it bad?
Yeah, that's good.
I'm giving it a ton, sorry.
No, that's good. I made enough. I definitely made enough.
That's how I feed myself.
So like she said, I chose the quinoa because it's kind of like a healthier option. You could, like she said, you could use the rice. It's something around here that people might not necessarily cook with all the time.
And if you want to make it vegetarian, you don't have to add the meat. You could add tofu or just leave it with the beans and the quinoa. It'll be.
You could even add other beans. You could add like
right.
some chickpeas.
Could you leave the cilantro off one for me?
Yes, of course. I can.
Go ahead and give it.
No, yes, of course, no problem. There you are. So in the recipe, I actually did not season, like I said, I did not season the ground turkey with the cumin or the chili powder, just because once I cooked that turkey sausage, I mixed everything together, and then I threw it in the crock pot, and that's how I cooked it. So you'll notice the flavors just kind of meld together. It's not a super complicated dish to just throw together and make in the crock pot, and it's a really nice one. I think my servings are a little bigger on these papers. I think I about doubled this recipe and it made a lot. So it looks like it made more than, 12 servings.
Quinoa will do that to you. Quinoa can
Thank you.
create more than you think.
I'm sorry, I'm gonna just cut through.
And this would be a good dish where the leftovers you could put in a container, freeze, and then you have another meal for some other time.
There's no way to.
I can get rid of this one though, if you don't mind. Yes?
In your instructions, you say you greased your slow cooker.
I did. So if you notice, also within the recipe, there isn't really any added liquid. It's just the enchilada sauce. I drained and I rinsed the black beans because I didn't want all that extra starch that's kind of sitting in that black bean can. And so the only sauce I really had is the enchilada sauce. And it was a little thicker. You know, it's almost kind of like a tomato sauce, obviously. I didn't really think a lot of it was going to get really absorbed into that quinoa. So I greased, in a couple of these recipes, I greased the crock pot just because it's cooking for a while. There's not a lot of liquid in there, and I want to make sure that it doesn't stick and burn to the pan.
What did you use?
I just used a little pan spray. Not a big layer or anything, but you could always try it without it and maybe just add a little chicken stock instead and see if that works. Here you are. But I just decided to grease it. You're welcome.
Was the enchilada sauce the recipe?
So yeah, so I also just did a homemade enchilada sauce. I put a recipe within your packet. I don't think it's right behind that recipe, but it's pretty close. Just in case anyone feels like up for making their own sauce or just wants a recipe. Honestly, it's probably cheaper to buy one, but I really enjoy making my own. It lets me decide how spicy I want to make it. I can make as much of it as I want, and it gives me a chance to showcase some more of my own flavors and techniques in it.
Anyone feels like they didn't get enough?
There you are. Get some more back there.
What size crock pot would you use for this recipe as it's printed?
For which one?
The one.
This one? I used a pretty big, so I had this one.
But you doubled it.
I doubled it, so I did it in 2 of these crock pots. Yeah, so I did 2 6-quart crock pots.
Okay.
Just so there's enough space because the quinoa does expand. I mean, it doesn't get huge like rice would, but I mean, it still expands a little bit. Thank you. But like that, just.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, you could always do a little. That's why it says some of the options. You could do sour cream. You could do some lime juice. Avocado would be really good. I kept it a little more basic so I wasn't out here throwing on too many toppings, but those are all great ideas. Otherwise, you could, put more salsa or pico. The salsa that I used for this one also, I did like a homemade pico. So kind of the one that we do here, just fresh tomatoes, all fresh ingredients. And I just blended it all together, except for the tomatoes, I cut them into pieces. Yes.
Paige, another question.
Yes.
Some of our crock pot recipes specify the order in which you put the ingredients in. Is there anything special we need to know about this one?
Nope, this one I literally, I brought all the stuff to show you, but honestly I literally just cooked the turkey and then I mixed, once it was cooled down, I guess it doesn't have to be cooled down, but I drained all the excess fat and water from it because turkey sausage tends to produce a lot of liquid. I drained that. I just mixed everything together in one big bowl and I put it in my crock pot. And so then I just let it sit and cook for the 3 hours on high. Like she said, the hours always vary. So if you're going to work and you want it to cook slow, you could just turn it on low and let it cook for a little bit longer. But quinoa is one of those things that overcooks very quickly, so you just do have to be kind of careful about it. You don't want it to be a whole mushy mess. So.
Hey, sorry, I'm confused. The recipe says a pound of ground turkey, but the instructions say you're using turkey sausage. And you mentioned sausage, so which?
I meant just ground turkey.
Okay.
I'm sorry. Because I always just call it ground turkey sausage, but I mean just plain ground turkey. You could always try, like, you know, they have seasoned ground turkeys. You could always do that, but then you're incorporating, you know, more sodium and more preservatives. So I would kind of not suggest that. I would try to get more flavors in naturally by making your own homemade salsa or your, you know, own enchilada sauce. So I think that really helps. Like if you notice, I didn't add any salt to this actual recipe. I just used, you know, the salsa, the enchilada sauce. I was just trying to draw the flavors together with that. And then obviously the cheddar cheese on top is going to have some salt in it. So that was like the only added salt. But.
And instead of sour cream, you could always use plain Greek yogurt, which has a nice tangy.
Or add some lime to it, make it like a lime cream. That'd be very good. All right,
It says component 2 recipe shrimp. Yeah.
Is that if you want to add shrimp to it?
Yeah.
No,
That was an accident.
that was a typo. I think he accidentally grabbed that from a different little recipe.
Take that off.
So yeah, but I mean,
It wouldn't hurt.
you could always add it afterwards if you really wanted, but no, that was just an accident. So,
So what do we think about this dish? I mean, it may not be for everybody.
Looks good.
Looks tasty.
it's good.
And it's one of these that also, it'll keep well in the fridge, or like I said, you can freeze it, or you can make it a component of another meal, you know, that you might, we like to say reuse.
You could do ground beef instead of the turkey. Obviously, it's not going to be quite as good for you, but by all means, you know, you could always do that.
Firm tofu would be good too, because that'll absorb whatever flavor you put in. If you're a vegetarian and you want some more protein or an additive, that's an option too. And you can play around with what other vegetables you like if you want to put in some hot peppers or something else. Kind of the sky's the limit on that one. All right. I understand if you're thirsty, so don't hesitate. Don't hesitate to come up. Does anyone need a water break? I don't want anyone
Does have a little tip to it.
being parched.
And if it is a little too hot, that was probably my enchilada sauce. I didn't mean to make it very spicy, but I know the rest of the ingredients kind of don't have a lot of flavors on their own. So I was really, like I said, trying to draw from my sauce. So that's up to you when you go to the store. If you end up buying a sauce instead of making it, you know, they have the options of mild and medium and hot. So you could always vary it that way.
Perfect.
Very good.
So we're just talking a little bit about liquid. If you're cooking something like from a different recipe, let's say, and you're trying to make it more into a crock pot recipe, we recommend reducing the liquid by half. Moisture does not evaporate because the lid is on when you're cooking, so you don't want something to be too soupy. You might need to decrease the liquid that you're adding to it, except for rice, beans, or pasta. But some of those items like rice, beans, and pasta, you can cook separately ahead of time and add those at the very end of your dish as well, if you're concerned about how that is going to cook. Generally, if you're doing beans, like let's say dry beans in a crock pot, using 2 cups of liquid for every cup of beans. If you're adding any dairy to your recipe, let's say stroganoff, beef stroganoff, add the dairy the last 15 to 30 minutes of cooking. So it, don't simmer or boil it though. You don't want it scorching or curdling. Condensed soups may be substituted for milk, and they can cook a little bit longer. And milk, cream, sour cream will break down if it's cooked for too long, which is another reason why you're adding it towards the end of the recipe. So some little tips on meat here. We talked about removing the visible fat. The thing that I didn't realize was browning your meat before you put it in will enhance the flavor. So you can brown your meat, and then you can also, what they call it, the deglaze?
Deglaze, yep.
Deglaze to get all the nice, yummy, what do you call those, brown pieces?
Yeah, little bits.
Yes, the little bits of goodness. And then you can use a little bit of wine or a little bit of liquid to do that, and then put that in with your meat as well. But the browning of the meat does give it extra flavor. Large pieces of meat or whole chickens can be cut into smaller pieces, especially if you're worried about the size of your crock pot and fitting everything in there. That'll help it cook a little bit more thoroughly and evenly. Meat should be thawed prior to going into a crock pot for a safe dish. Now, I haven't always done this with chicken breasts, but ideally is what they're recommending here, just to be safe with temperature and cooking. Again, because you're starting with such a cold frozen item, that it may warm up at an uneven pace. Season meat lightly. Place a half cup of liquid in the crock pot. So your choice of liquid, though, can vary to whatever you feel like experimenting with. Water, stock, wine. And with wine, they recommend using a good wine, something that you would drink, because that flavor is going to permeate throughout the crock pot. It's not like it's going to dissipate out like it would if you're cooking on the stovetop. So also the alcohol does stay in a little bit, so have a light hand when you're pouring it into your meal. Lemon juice, orange juice, those are both nice. Tomato juice as well are nice acidic juices, so they also help tenderize the meat or the protein that you're using. And they're also nice strong flavors too. Bouillon, if you're putting like bouillon cube in liquid, you can do that. The meat temperature, we like to see above 165.
Could you talk a minute about meat thermometers? I mean,
Let
maybe
Paige
Santa
talk.
will bring me one.
That's a great
I
gift
don't know
idea.
the difference.
So here we actually use, we use both. There's just the normal thermometer that you actually have to calibrate yourself. So if you're doing it like home cooking and you want a thermometer, I would suggest doing a digital one just because it's a lot easier. And we have a couple of those here. I mean, they're just a little more convenient. Otherwise, you have to calibrate the other ones by sticking them into ice water and calibrating it to the right temperature. And you have to do that every so often to make sure that it's accurate. So a digital one is probably,
Probe then?
it's,
When you say digital?
the digital has the numbers pop up. Just like a digital clock or a digital watch. It's the same, it has the numbers. The other one has like the little numbers around it like a turn clock would, like any of those. So that's a little harder. But yeah, a digital thermometer is probably best.
So, like, I have a probe with my thermometer.
Okay.
Is that,
No, that's not bad. You probably just need to check it and calibrate it every once in a while. So that's, if it has a little thing on it to calibrate it, I'm not 100% sure with the probes if it's the same as like the ones we have here, which I can go check and compare them with you also and see. But yeah, I would just kind of suggest the digital ones. And
You could use, it doesn't have to just be a meat thermometer. You could use one thermometer for
Yeah.
several items.
yeah,
It would
you
be
could.
different than a candy thermometer, which would have to be a higher
Yeah.
temperature. But
But yeah, you can use it for different
thermometer
things.
is
Mhm.
versatile. Yeah. Good question. So we talk about the frozen meat again, because some of us don't think ahead and thaw our meat ahead of time. But you can use frozen meat, adding at least a cup of warm liquid to the stoneware before putting the meat in it. Again, that kind of heats up your crock pot. In that case, you would have to preheat your slow cooker because you're adding the warm liquid to it, which will warm it up. And then recipes containing frozen meat, you might cook for an additional 4 to 6 hours on low or an additional 2 hours on high. It really depends on the meat. You know, how much meat, how dense is it, how frozen is it. So you might just have to be a little more careful and be checking it. Another thing about meat that I did not know, adding crumbled gingerbread or ginger snap cookies to a slow cooker meat dish, like beef stew, pot roast, some more of your beef dishes, and sauerbraten will add a flavor and a texture to that. So I would like to try that.
Yeah.
We do that with our sauerbraten here, actually. She makes a ginger snap gravy, so.
I did not know that. It's perfect for the holidays because you think, you know, Christmas time, gingerbread. And maybe you have leftover cookies that you don't know what to do with, so. From vegetables and dried beans, you want to make sure that you're cutting your vegetables in uniform pieces. That way it gets uniform cooking. You don't necessarily have to saute them except for eggplant. Eggplant's a little bit bitter, so you have to saute it first before putting it in your crock pot. For some people, they want to limit strong flavored vegetables. So cauliflower, turnips, those types of things, some of those root vegetables. They may permeate other flavors in the food. That doesn't mean you can't use them at all. It's just maybe be aware of that or cook it on the side perhaps. And then add it to your dish. They talk about placing the root vegetables near the sides or bottom of the stoneware. They cook a little bit slower than the meat. They're denser. Rinse beans, remove any damaged beans or non-food items before you put them in your crock pot. I think that's just good practice no matter how you're cooking your beans. Put them in a strainer and cleaning them off first. If you're doing beans, dried beans, placing them in the beans, the flavoring in cold water, and then cooking on low 8 to 10 hours is how you would do that. Try not adding sugar or tomato mixtures to beans until they're already softened. So, and if veggies are too mushy, you can remove them. Let's say you overcook them, remove it. You can puree it and either add it as a side dish or puree it back into whatever sauce that you're using there. So, way of hiding those vegetables, and let's say you're making a meal for children as well. So you never should have to throw something away, hopefully. You just might have to change the state that you offer it in. Well, we talk a little bit about soups. Cutting vegetables again in uniform sizes. Vegetables on the bottom, meat on top. I think I've done that the opposite my whole life, so I learned something here. This makes a little more sense. Add water only to cover the vegetables, so you don't want to add too much liquid again. If you're desiring a thinner soup, you can add more liquid at the end of the cooking. You can always add more liquid. Cooking pasta and rice at the end of the cooking time is when you can add it. So I would cook my pasta on the side, same thing with the rice. If you add just pasta to it, then all of a sudden the pasta expands and you end up with a big goulash. And I've done that as well. And you can do parboiled rice that's been partially boiled, and that'll do fine in a slow cooker. It's been partially cooked already. So that won't absorb all of your liquid, like, let's say, uncooked rice or uncooked pasta would. A little bit about seasonings, herbs, and spices. Whole herbs and spices will increase in flavor while cooking. You may want to use half the amount that's listed in the recipe unless you really like a strong seasoning flavor. Ground spices will lose their flavor, so don't add those until the very end of your cooking. The last hour at the most or even less. And then fresh herbs are best when they're just used to finish the dish. So as you're serving it, that's when I would add the fresh, like she did with the cilantro, adding that as you're serving it. Tomatoes, vinegar, wine, or citrus juices that can be used as a marinade, so as a tenderizing process. So for longer cook times, you can add that towards the last 15 to 30 minutes if you desire. A little bit about food safety. You want your food to reach a minimal temperature, internal temperature of 140 within 4 hours. And if your crock pot is properly calibrated, like we mentioned in the very beginning, then this should not be an issue. We talked a little bit about cutting food into chunks or small enough pieces. That way you can ensure the thorough cooking of it and the uniform cooking as well. All right, what recipe would you like to do next?
Okay, I'm actually going to show you just how I did the Brussels sprouts and then serve those. But before I start that, I want to comment on when she was just talking about soups. So I only put one soup recipe in here actually, and it looks pretty basic. And I know it kind of, well, maybe you'll look at it a little weird and just say, oh, it's only a few ingredients, how's it going to taste good? But the thing I like doing with soups, especially slow cooker soups, is I really enjoy putting in kind of bone-in meats to really draw out the flavor, so I don't have to really add a lot of meat stock or a lot of salt depending on what meat I'm adding. So the recipe I put in your packet is actually a ham and lentil soup. I wrote it on there because you could do ham steaks, but I really suggest if you try making this soup to do the ham hocks. They're actually generally pretty cheap when you go to the grocery store. A lot of people probably don't buy them because they're not quite sure what to do with them besides like making a ham stock. But so when you add it into the soup, it really helps develop that ham flavor. And then there's also so much meat that's underneath the skin in there that you can actually just pull off and keep it in your soup, and you don't have to add additional meat to it. So that's why I wrote a little side note on there. It really draws out a lot of flavor. You get the saltiness from the pork itself, and like I said, you actually get quite a good amount of meat off of the ham hocks for the price that you pay. So if you don't like ham, you could always do it with like beef shanks are usually pretty cheap too at the stores, and it's because it has those bones in it and people aren't really quite sure what to utilize them for, but they're really just really great for making soups, so you can always just kind of keep that in the back of your mind. If you're vegetarian, obviously you wouldn't want to use either of those options and just throw more veggies in there and switch to a veggie stock. But if you do like meat and you want a cheaper option that really gives you a lot of flavor, those are kind of some things I suggest. So, okay.
I was just going to comment that Glenn's has magnificent ham hocks.
Okay.
They also have a smoked option, and they're
Yeah.
just awesome for
And they really give you a lot of flavor.
Yeah.
You guys have cooked with them before?
absolutely.
Yeah, so I mean, and you, generally they're, like I said, sometimes cheaper, so depending on where you go, you know, and it's always just a great option. So yes, the next thing I'm going to show you is the Brussels sprouts I made. So that wonderful smell of cider is going to disappear when I open this crock pot, and it's going to smell like Brussels sprouts. But I hope that's okay. But I figured it was that time of year. All right. Jeez Louise. I'm probably going to have you help me again, if that's okay.
That's fine.
All right. Does anyone not want any Brussels sprouts? Because I know some people don't like Brussels sprouts.
Just a little portion is what some people are saying.
Okay, just a little bit.
We won't make you clean your plate.
No. If you don't eat them, I won't be mad. It was just a nice little, a different suggestion with Brussels sprouts. I grew up with my mom making Brussels sprouts my whole life, but you know, she made it very unhealthy with bacon and bacon fat. I mean, it's delicious.
Come to my bacon class.
But-
Come to theirs. Well,
Do you want to scoop them?
sure. What do I do?
Because I have to put cheese on them.
Oh, okay.
So,
Oh, they look so pretty. It's got cranberries in them. It looks
so
Christmas.
I did a lot of, like 2 of the recipes, or almost 3 actually, have cranberries in them, which I know you would think I'm just kind of overdoing it, but it is, 'tis the season. I mean, it's perfect timing to use them. Like I did that cider, I'm going to show you how I made it very quickly in a little bit. I thought it was a great item. It was something different. I wrote on the little note, you can always jazz it up a little bit. We'll go through that later. But when you walked in, I'm sure you smelled it. It's just a wonderful thing you could do for the holidays, to have that sitting around. And people walk in and smell that cider.
And Wisconsin is the largest cranberry producing state, so you know
Yeah.
we're promoting ourselves here.
Are you using fresh cranberries most of the time then?
So for me here, I actually did, I did some sliced ones that we had on hand here. For this, I used dried ones for my granola, and I used some frozen for the cider. Since it was just going in the pot and it was just going to be cooking for a few hours, I figured the frozen wouldn't make quite a difference. You still get a really good flavor from them. Oh, thank you. But yeah, the recipes even state you can do frozen or fresh or even dried. I wouldn't suggest dried cranberries for like the cider. That would just, I believe, be way too expensive, and I don't think you'd get all the flavor that you really want. So I would suggest using either frozen or fresh. Right now is great because we can get fresh, because it's quite seasonal.
Paige, can I have 2 without the cheese? It's
Yes.
not a cheese, so if anyone has a, let us know if you don't like that.
Really pretty.
It is. It's like Christmas in a dish.
So these I did just with a little bit of, I'll show you when I toss them together, but I did a little just very simple seasonings again, and I'm trying to just draw the flavors together by using the components that I'm adding to it at the end, like adding the feta to get a nice saltiness to them. Otherwise, I've been keeping it a little more basic with the ingredients.
Would there be a different vegetable that they could use in place that would
Instead of the Brussels sprouts? Well, you could
broccoli, or I don't know?
You could probably change it up. Honestly, like I think more starch-wise, I think like sweet potatoes would be amazing in there if you did like that, tossed with the maple syrup, a little bit of salt and pepper, and then threw in some cranberries. I think that'd be really good. I would maybe change the cheese up then. I guess it kind of depends on your palate. Yeah, cabbage would be good.
Good way to use cabbage up too.
Or like a red cabbage would be very nice. I know it'd be very red, but I kind of like red cabbage. It's got a nice little sweetness to it also.
So if you were to use sweet potatoes, what kind of cheese would you change that to?
I actually would put goat cheese on it. Yeah, that would be my preference. Just because I would want to kind of go out more on the sweeter side and keep it more sweet. I'm trying to go savory, so the feta is helping by adding that little saltiness to it. But the goat cheese, I think, would just add a really nice earthiness, and it would tie in well with the maple syrup and everything in there. So honestly, it's going to be difficult for me to try to walk through this. I mean, it's kind of, I mean, it's really easy. So once again, I just cut my Brussels sprouts right in half. I peeled off any of the layers that were brown or that were turning different colors. If you get like little flaky leaves, I left them in there because I don't want to waste it, and I don't mind, you know, the mixture in there. Honestly, I just mixed everything together. I just put the oil right in there. I put the maple syrup right in there, some salt and pepper, and then you toss that and you let it cook in your slow cooker. So I wrote on the side notes there, with the cranberries, you want to do it at kind of the last minute. If you're using fresh or frozen, you want to do it the last 15 minutes of cook time. I believe it was 15. Yeah, so 15 minutes of cook time. Otherwise, they're going to overcook in there, or it might make it too tart. So if you're using dried cranberries, then you just want to toss them in right at the end before you top it with your feta cheese. Okay?
Can you substitute honey for the maple syrup or not?
Yeah, you sure can. A couple of my recipes here have pure maple syrup, but you can definitely substitute honey. That's a great substitute, actually. I don't know if that took up enough time.
What do we think about this recipe? I think if you like Brussels sprouts to begin with, then it's going to be a hit. And if you don't, maybe this will change your mind. I think the sweet potato with the goat cheese option would be another.
And then you just
Great
chunk
idea.
your sweet potato?
Yep. Yep. And depending on size is kind of how long it's going to take. I mean, it's a starch, so it's probably going to take a little bit longer than these Brussels sprouts, even though these take a little while because they're pretty thick. So, but I think sweet potatoes would be a great option.
If you were to talk about the size of a Brussels sprout?
Like the size of this half? Yeah, that should probably work in about the same time. Yeah, and it's always wise just to check it. Let it cook for at least, you know, a couple hours, and like she said, it takes a while for the crock pot to heat up. But then you can definitely just check it and see where it's at. If you need to cover it up and let it go, or if you want to turn it on low and give it some slower time to cook.
Great question.
Nutritional value of Brussels sprouts.
So Brussels sprouts are your, what we call the family of cruciferous vegetables. All vegetables will have low calories, lower in fats, high in fiber. Brussels sprouts, though, people don't realize are high in vitamin C, high in vitamin K, other antioxidants as well. So just overall a very good vegetable to have. I always tell people try to choose a variety of color when you're choosing vegetables, fruits, the food that you eat, which I think all of these have been great examples, especially the first recipe where you had all the peppers and the quinoa and the meat, and a little more color means you're getting more vitamins and minerals and nutrients too. So, any other questions? These are good.
Okay.
And it is possible to do, you know, your whole entire meal with crock pot, like having a veggie, having the main course, having the dessert. We'll get into all that too. There are crock pots where you have your base, and then there's 3 crock pots that you can put in. So that's
I should have got one of those
I know.
for this class. That would have been nice.
Have any of you seen the crock pots that you can program from your phone? So if you're someplace else. Crock pot. I was on their website.
I'm gonna
and
get rid of some.
I'm not just tech savvy, but crock pot has a crock pot with Wemo. So you hook it up to your Wi-Fi, plug it in at home, and then from wherever you are, you can set and program your crock pot to start. You can stop it, you can change the temperature on it. It's pretty impressive what they can do. I mean, I guess if you can lock and unlock your house, or turn on lights, or turn down the thermostat, you can start your meal. Which is really great in case you realize, did I forget to turn off my crock pot, or turn it on? Let's say you leave the house and you're like, oh, then all that food sits there and you have to throw it away when you get home. So if you're thinking about Christmas gifts, that could be something to check out too. But I was amazed when I saw that. Going back a little bit into food safety. So if you're not at home during the entire school process, power goes out. Throw away the food even if it looks done. So if you are home, so you are aware of when the power actually went out, you can finish cooking the ingredients immediately, perhaps on the stove. grill or someone else's house. You can just knock on their door and go in. But then at least you're aware of the timing of when the power went off and where the food's at. Leftovers, we always recommend taking it out of the crock pot base, putting it in a shallow cover container in the refrigerator within 2 hours after it's cooked. You want to avoid reheating in the crock pot base. Other means will actually heat it up more evenly and prevent burning or preventing cold or hot pockets in it. So a shallower dish would be better in smaller portions when you're reheating. You can then, once it's put into different sections, put it back in the crock pot to heat up, or to stay warm, I should say. A little bit of some fixes. Let's say if something didn't turn out quite the way you planned. It's too soupy. You can turn the slow cooker up to high. You can move the lid a little bit to let some of the liquid evaporate. Leave it for a bit. The liquid does evaporate. You can mix a little solution of cornstarch and cold water. That's more of a thickener then, or a slurry, is what they call it. You can also stir it into a hot broth and juice, let it thicken, and then you can put that in to your crock pot. You can always take out the liquid, and then you can reduce it on the stovetop. And then that's a sauce or a glaze that you can use on the dish, so you're not wasting anything, if you have that ambition to do that. Otherwise, I just take off the liquid and be done with it. Let's say I've had this happen to you. Crock pot dish comes out and it's very blah. It doesn't have much flavor, probably because you've overcooked it. Or you could sear the meat, like we talked about, browning the meats, deglazing then in the liquid in the pan and using the caramelized bits to add more flavor. You can use any type of oil when you're doing that. So that's one way of adding flavor. Or you could take a look at the seasonings, the herbs and the spices that you've used. You can take a look at the sauce or the liquid that you're using. If you're using just water, try changing it up like we mentioned with using wine or the broth, something with a little flavor to it. Let's say the chicken came out dry or it came out raw. Neither one is good. A whole chicken can take 8 to 10 hours to cook on low, 3 to 5 hours on high. It should be elevated, so a lot of slow cookers come with a rack that you put in it, so it's not on the bottom of the slow cooker. You can also invert a glass pan. You could also you can crumple up a bunch of aluminum tinfoil balls and put that on the bottom, and then put your chicken on top of that too. So just a way of elevating it off the direct heat. Chicken breasts and boneless varieties, they'll cook faster than bone-in. Frozen pieces of chicken will take 6 to 8 hours, depending on the size and thickness. So, frozen whole chicken isn't typically recommended. Just, it's hard to get with the bones and everything, the inside temperature to be accurate. And bone-in chicken is a little more forgiving, so it takes a little bit longer to dry out. So there's that benefit. Now we're going to talk a little bit, just some ideas. I think people sometimes overlook the crock pot option for breakfast, and there's such wonderful opportunity there. You can cook it overnight and then wake up to a breakfast in a house smelling really good, and then not have to scurry around in the morning trying to find something to eat. So people have made cinnamon rolls in the crock pot, French toast, breads, buns, casseroles, egg muffins, oatmeal. We make a great breakfast quinoa sometimes here. Quiche and frittatas. So those are just some breakfast ideas. I mean, really, the sky's the limit on that. People are a little more familiar with lunch and dinner ideas. Beans and rice, beef stroganoff, chili, enchiladas, lasagna, paella, pulled pork, mac and cheese, soups, stews, and stuffed peppers. And I think there's a stuffed pepper recipe in here.
On the
I
back.
think it's the very back one. You just want to turn to that recipe. And that's a nice recipe too, because you can, if you're not using all your stuffed peppers, you can, again, freeze that and make an extra amount to use later on. Anything we should know about this recipe? Or is it pretty
No,
self-explanatory?
it's pretty self-explanatory. We actually, if you notice, I did not cook the ground turkey this time. I wrote sausage again. I guess it's supposed to just be ground turkey. I told you, I just get so confused here because we always just call it turkey sausage. So I didn't cook it just because it's going to be in that slow cooker for a while, and it's actually going to cook with all the other ingredients in that pepper. But like I said before, it's not listed in here, but you always just want to make sure that your meats are temped to the right temperature, like she said in her slide. And I'm actually going to talk about when I discuss the frozen meal that I have. But you always want to just make sure your the meats are cooked to the right temperature. So even if you're following the directions on any recipe with any kind of meats, you always just want to check the meats just to make sure they're fully cooked. So. And so ground meats are 155 and poultry is 165 temperatures, what you want them cooked to. Okay.
And some thermometers will have the kind of the added information that comes with it, so you don't have to memorize it. The desserts are often overlooked, but you can do baked apples, bread pudding, brownies, cake, cheesecake, cobbler, coffee cake, crisp fudge, which we have a recipe for. If it is that time of year, fudge is always great. Pies and even scones. I even looked up creme brulee today that you can do in the crock pot. As long as you have the ramekins, you can put those in there and set it and forget it. So it's kind of a nice way if you're not into really baking, but you want to make some desserts. This is kind of a little bit easier, shall I say, or more forgiving using the crock pot. So looking at the fudge recipe, is there anything, or is it pretty self-explanatory?
It's pretty self-explanatory. So with the fudge recipe, though, if you notice, like she was talking about different sizes for crock pots, this one is saying to use a smaller crock pot. If you decide that if you only have like a 5-quart or 6-quart crock pot and you want to make the fudge, the cooking time is probably just going to be lower because obviously there's more surface area for it to spread out and it's going to start melting and cooking faster. So this one, it's pretty self-explanatory. Once again, you just mix the chocolate chips, the sweetened condensed milk, and vanilla in the crock pot. You cook it on low, uncovered, stirring it occasionally. And then this one I said add walnuts at the end. You spray a little 8x8 inch pan that's lined with parchment paper. You pour it in there, you let it set for a couple hours, you can remove it and then cut it into chunks. So it's a very nice, easy fudge recipe. I did write optional at the bottom. I try to give you guys different options and ideas. So you could use any kind of nuts. If you don't want to use walnuts, you could do almonds, pecans, peanuts, or you could omit the nuts altogether and prepare the fudge as it's written otherwise and top it with some melted caramel if you wanted. Or you could do melted caramel with a little bit of sea salt, which is really popular now to do like a sea salted caramel fudge. You could replace the nuts completely with like chopped peppermint pieces, so it'd be like more like this holiday kind of fudge. Or you could just do it any which way and then drizzle it with some melted white chocolate afterwards. So those are just a few options you could always do.
Drizzle peanut butter on top.
You could mix dried fruit in there if you wanted to do like dried fruit in there. So
Toffee pieces. So any candy bar can be crushed and it can be sprinkled onto your fudge. So
that's very true.
Oreos, you name it. So plenty of options there. All right. I think the next one, which would lead us into our beverages. So this is kind of a nice option too, especially if you're entertaining guests. It could be like a self-service like we have over here with our cider. You can do chai tea, cider, eggnog, hot chocolate.
Wait. What do you mean eggnog?
So like a basic eggnog recipe you could do in your crock pot.
Okay.
I haven't actually made it myself, but it's an
I haven't
option.
either.
Okay.
Hot chocolate, and there's loads of recipes on different hot chocolates. Punch, spiced coffee, spiced tea, and spiced wine. And I think you've had our cider here, which we just wanted to point out we did not add any extra sugar to that, so that would be the sugar from the fruit. So that would be what we would call a natural sugar. What did you think of the cider? I don't know if you've all had a chance.
So to talk about that, if you don't mind, once again, like I said, it's really hard for me to kind of demo these things because it's pretty much either just throwing things together and throwing them in a pot, or just really basic instructions on it. But the cranberry apple cider. So what I did was I took 5 apples. I wrote Gala apples. If you wanted something like extremely tart, you could do Granny Smith apples. Here I actually ended up doing the Red Delicious because that's something we had on hand, so it wasn't quite as sweet, so that might be why it also was a little more tart. But I just chopped each of the ends off, which I guess I can show you really quick. I mean, it was pretty easy. It really wasn't that much work. I guess the hardest part was at the end when I strained it, which I don't have any of that blended, so I can more so walk you through it. But I just really easily just cut off the end pieces. I didn't peel it or anything because you're going to be straining it later on. But I just actually cut around the core just to make sure the seeds weren't in there. And then I just left them with the skin on and then just kind of put them into big chunks, almost like wedges. I cut up the 5 apples like that and I threw them in the crock pot. Then I peeled the orange. I discarded the all the peels, which you could actually leave them in there if you wanted to. Just, I don't think you really want to blend them. So it might be something you want to add at the end after you blend it and strain it if you want to get a little bit more orange. Yeah, some garnish or get a little more orange flavor. But I just peeled it. Once again, I just discarded the peel. I didn't really need to use it, I guess. I kind of garnished more with the cinnamon sticks. But once you have it all peeled, you just wedge it and you throw it in there. And I let it cook on high in here in the crock pot for 4 hours. After it was done, I threw it all in a blender. I blended it all up. So I shouldn't say I threw it all in the blender. I took the cinnamon sticks out first. So don't blend it with the cinnamon sticks in there. I almost did, and I'm like, oh wait, how many did I put in here? I gotta find them all. But I took the cinnamon sticks out, I blended all that other stuff up, and then I strained it through a really, really fine strainer. So we call it a chinois. I'm not sure what kind of strainers you have at home. You could always use a cheesecloth and squeeze it through a cheesecloth. If you really don't mind it being like thick and pulpy, you can leave the pulp in there. It's just not going to be a nice clear cider like the one I had. It's just going to be a little thicker. It's going to be a little cloudier, but it'll still have that great flavor. So,
The nice thing, if you have extra, you could save it and use it in a smoothie that you're making the next day. You could also freeze it in ice cube trays, and then it could, those ice cubes could be used to flavor other items then too. If you're doing like a cold beverage, maybe adding that into a white soda or something like that. So don't feel like you have to throw it away if it's not being used.
Oh, and I did write right at the bottom, which I'm not sure if I already mentioned that, about how you can always add a little bourbon or a little whiskey or a little brandy if you want to make it more of just like an adult-only cider for the holidays. So you can always think about doing something like that. You don't have to. It's good just by itself. But if you want to, those are some ideas.
I could probably go for any of the beverages. You can pick your drink of choice there. So, perfect.
And I am going to show them granola also. So I'm not sure if you wanted me to keep going or...
Perfect. As you can see, you have some granola in front of you to take home with you.
Is yours just to end? Are you just ending it?
Yeah, I'm good.
Oh, okay. So then I'm just going to talk for a little bit. So at the very front, I wrote Crock Pot granola. Now I know Eric, who used to be one of the bosses in the kitchen, came in here and he looked at it and he's like, "There's no way you did this in a crock pot." Well, I did. So what's important about it is the very first ingredient says old-fashioned oats. You have to use old-fashioned oats. You can't use quick oats. They're not going to work. They're not going to get dry enough then. So like she said also, by leaving your lid a little askew, a little open, it allows all that steam to come out. So it's not steaming your ingredients. It's just cooking them, but still drying them out. So that's what we were doing with this granola. So I'm going to show you how I whipped it together. Once again, it was pretty easy. So I did the old-fashioned oats. I mixed in some of the flaxseed meal, which I was going to have Becky explain the benefits of, using flaxseed or flaxseed meal, or I could have added chia seeds to it also.
So the flaxseed meal, any of your seeds, flax seeds, chia seeds, hemp seeds, are going to be good sources of fiber, protein, those omega-3 healthy fatty acids. It's just some of them will have a little bit different textures to them. So with the flaxseed, that gets ground like a meal. So you can buy it ground, or you can buy the seeds and grind it yourself as you use it in a coffee grinder. With any of the seeds, especially once you grind it, you do need to refrigerate it because of the fat content. You don't want it to be going rancid if you sit it at room temperature too long. You would tell because the smell would be off, it can indicate to you. If you're using hemp seeds are a little bit more of a nutty flavor and a chewy texture, so not as fine as the flaxseed. With flaxseed, it does need to be ground to get any of the nutritional benefits from it. The other seeds you don't need to grind to use. With the chia seeds, be aware that chia will sometimes grab onto any liquid that's available and will then start to gel and chunk up. So
That might be better to toss at the end, maybe,
yes,
if you wanted
maybe more
to.
towards the end.
Just toss them in. So I guess it's, like I said, it's pretty self-explanatory, but so I use this 2 large egg whites, room temperature. It's better to have them at room temperature because you really want to whip them up and get them really frothy. That also applies to the spiced nut recipe that I have on here because it has you whip up egg whites. They're a really nice binder whenever you're doing like granolas or spiced nuts. So I pretty much just whipped them. I guess I'll show you. It's gonna take me a minute. So, and it's gonna be a little loud. But if you had like a hand mixer with a whip attachment or a KitchenAid with the little whip attachment, that would help. I'm just doing the old-fashioned elbow grease. So you just want it so it just starts, it almost like doubled in size, and it gets nice and frothy with like little bubbles on it. You just want to make sure that you got them really whipped up. So, like I said, I just did that. I did maple syrup, and then I did coconut oil and vanilla.
Can you do a different oil?
A different oil in it? I'm sure you could. Actually, the coconut oil, I did this one because it's healthier for you also. You could do like a canola oil. I'm sure you could do it with, you wouldn't want to do olive oil, but maybe if you tried like avocado oil, you could maybe do something like that.
Probably the same type of fat
or-
content.
Yeah.
Avocado oil and peanut oil.
Yeah, walnut oil would be really good. Yeah, I think that I should have actually done that. But I thought the coconut oil was a good example too.
Any of those oils will be more expensive than usual oil, but they're going to work better and add more flavor.
And then I also actually want to comment, if you are making this for someone who's vegan or you yourself are vegan, you can substitute the egg whites for another 1/4 cup of coconut oil. So you just kind of want to, I mean, obviously you won't do that frothiness and it might not bind as much as you wanted it to, but it will be vegan. So you could do that. But yeah, I just mixed it all together. In here is the oats, the flaxseed meal, the nuts, cinnamon, and the salt. I just toss those together. So like I said, when you put it in the crock pot, once again, I sprayed the crock pot. I really wanted to make sure this didn't stick to the bottom. You can either mix this all together in a bowl, or like the recipe says, you can put the first 5 ingredients into the crock pot and then do this egg white, oil syrup mixer in a little bowl and then just pour it in there and mix it together. Just make sure when you're cooking it then to put that lid almost like perpendicular so it's not steaming it. You want to make sure you have all those openings so it can release that steam. So this one is a little more difficult because you do need to stir it every 30 minutes. Otherwise, it's really not going to work. You need to just go over, stir it. I set a timer. I was just over there stirring it every 30 minutes today. But it really helps incorporate the flavors. It helps toast the nuts and dry out the granola. When that was all said and done, I laid it out on a little baking sheet with a little bit of parchment paper, and I let it crisp up and get nice and crispy like that. So it wasn't any like sticky or anything. So, And then, yeah, you can add your dried fruits, whatever your choices are. You could even add chocolate chips or dark chocolate chips, which would be a great option. I decided to do the whole almonds in mine. I did dried figs, golden raisins, and craisins. So it's a nice little mix. You can use it on yogurt for parfaits. You can put it on, you know, pancakes and waffles, or you can just eat it plain as a snack. So, okay. Does anyone have questions about that at all?
One thing is making your own granola. You know exactly what store-made or store-bought granola. You have to be careful about the amount of salt they put in and or the amount of sugar they might be adding to it. So it's just a thought there.
Okay. And it makes quite a bit. Like I said, I had to multiply all these recipes, so there's a lot of cooking in these crock pots today, but luckily they all cooked within, you know, 2.5, 3 hours, so I had plenty of time to do them. But I did this recipe times 5, and it got enough for everybody to get a big old little handful of that to take home. So if you're doing it for like a lot of people, or if you have kids, or if you're doing it for functions, you can bring a big portion.
Did you do a larger amount just in a bigger crock
No.
pot, or you did batches?
I did 3 batches. So I did it times 5, but I had to break it up into 3 crock pots. Because if I put it all in one, there's no way it's going to dry out and it's going to cook fully. So it was a lot harder for me to do these giant portions today. I had to break them up, but luckily I was here for 10 hours, so I had plenty of time.
Dry your own figs? I know you guys
No.
do figs.
No, these ones we had dried. But yeah, like the holiday meal, I love figs. So I definitely wanted to incorporate them in there. You know, they have a nice little taste to them. So I don't really have anything else to show you, but I did want to talk to you about a couple more things, if you don't mind listening, I guess, for a little bit. So like I said, also the cinnamon spice nuts, which is on the 3rd page, is going to be really similar to how I just did the granola. You're going to whip up the egg white with the vanilla. You're going to toss in the nuts and then the sugars and the cinnamon. So with this recipe, it's really important to add the water in the end. If you read through it just really quickly, it says place in the slow cooker sprayed with cooking spray, and you cook it on low for 3 hours. Now this one, I don't have the lid ajar. It's just going to be fully covering the crock pot. It's actually going to help kind of incorporate the sugars and help kind of like, I don't want to say melt it together, but it's gonna make everything mix up together. Just what's important is when you add the water in the end, it's going to help kind of harden and crystallize that sugar. So this one's a little different because we have so much more sugar in it that it can have the lid covered, if that makes sense. I guess I'm not really sure how to explain that, but I don't need it to dry it out because the water in the end is going to work with the sugars and dry it out. You just got to make sure, once again, you spread it out on a baking sheet that has some parchment paper on it, so it can just crisp up on its own and dry out fully and cool down. Any questions on that?
On the nuts and
Yeah.
like the granola, if you were to make it, like for dips and stuff,
Mm-hmm.
how do you store it and how long is it okay?
So it should definitely just be in like an airtight container. That's the best way to store anything like that, just to keep any air out of there to, you know, you don't want any bacteria to grow or anything. But honestly, the shelf life on it, it can probably last maybe a couple weeks. It just depends on how crisp it's going to get. Like the chances of it developing a lot of bacterial growth, I mean, there would really have to be like a lot of added moisture. It'd have to be like in a warmer place. Like those are things that affect bacteria growth. But if you have it in the cupboard in an airtight container, it's going to last a couple weeks. It's just after a while, just like anything you have, it's going to start getting stale. Just because you cooked it, it's not going to last that long, like the crispiness. The flavor will still be there and it'll still be okay. It just won't be crunchy. So then I also included a couple other recipes that I didn't show you, but the cranberry orange pork was one. Once again, it's a little easier, but it's just for the protein option of the meal. I said you could do a pork loin, a pork roast, or a pork butt. I personally would probably like to do a pork loin or a pork tenderloin, just because I like to be able to like slice it and serve you an actual piece. If you do the roast or the butt, it's probably going to break down and it's going to be more almost like a shredded pork, which is still very delicious. But But anyways, this one, it's also just very basic, just mixing the sugar, the salt, the pepper. And I wrote pumpkin pie spice, which you might think is weird, but it's really giving you some good flavors. You're getting some cloves, some nutmeg, some cinnamon. You have a question?
Yes.
Yeah.
You talked about using pork tenderloin,
Yes.
but they're only like a pound or a pound and a half. And
So-
can you put several in one crock pot?
Yeah, I'd probably do like maybe just 2 of them. Because, yeah, you're right. They're usually like maybe like a pound and a half. So, yeah, if you put 2 in there side by side, you just probably don't want them necessarily touching. So if you can fit them, so maybe if they're touching more on the sides, that's okay. I just wouldn't want the meat to necessarily overlap because it might affect its cooking process.
But is that going to take as long for
Uh,
a tenderloin as it would for a loin or a roast?
Not necessarily. With like that's why I didn't write pork tenderloin. But if you're doing a pork tenderloin, it probably is still going to take about like the same amount of time if you're putting 2 in there because there's more meat in there taking up more volume. If you're only doing 1, it's probably going to take a lot less. But this is also on low, so I did it so it's going to be really low and really slow. If you wanted to do it faster, once again, you can look at the conversion chart and just probably do it on high for a few hours, and it'll cook it. And also with pork tenderloins, I'm not sure if everyone here knows, you can eat that. It doesn't have to be well done. So it's one of those things nowadays where you don't have to eat pork tenderloin well done. It can be medium. It can be medium well. If there's a slight pink, it's okay. Definitely don't eat it if it's raw, because that's not good. But a nice, like a little warm pink in the middle is actually very good. It's very tender, and it's actually.
Is there a temperature for that?
Yeah, I believe it's. That I have to look it up, honestly.
Let's say 165.
I think it's at least 165 for the middle to be warm and fully cooked.
Would you sear that or?
This recipe, I just have you putting it in, just rubbing it down. If you really want to lock in flavors, that's definitely not a bad idea. I just made this kind of more as easy, I guess. But if you wanted to sear it, I would just sear it right away. Then you rub it down with the mustard and you sprinkle it with the sugars and stuff and you put it in there. Like she said, when you sear stuff, it locks in that flavor, which is awesome. The last 2 that I guess are on here, I included a red wine braised short ribs. This is one of my all-time favorites. It's on the last page. I like it because it's very versatile because you can change it up, but this is something I've made for me and my boyfriend have had it. I've made it just for my family. I made it for my brother and his wife when they did like a fancy meal together. And I did it different ways. So this recipe, I did short ribs. If you want, a great substitute is a chuck roast. So it would just be a red wine braised pot roast. That's always a great option. You'll have to look at the cooking times because it'll probably increase a little bit. Just because a chuck roast is bigger, there's going to be more volume and it's going to be higher in weight. But honestly, chuck roasts are a little bit, usually a little cheaper than buying short ribs, and I think it's great. I think it's a great meat. But yeah, this one's a little more involved, but if you have any questions while you're reading over this, I guess I'm not going to go through it too much. It's just heating up the oil. You want to dredge the short ribs or the roast in a mixture of the flour, onion powder, garlic powder, salt and pepper. You want to kind of just like toss them in that and give them a nice sear in the hot oil in a pan. I then remove the short ribs from the pan and then I add the vegetables. I just want to make sure I do that right. I add the vegetables, cook that for a couple minutes, add my tomato paste, cook that, and then I deglaze it with the red wine. And then after all that's said and done, you throw it in the crock pot, cover it, and let it cook. So I like this meal because you have vegetables, you have potatoes in there, and you have a protein, so it's all in one crock pot. I wrote at the bottom for options. If you want, you could use a different, like your favorite dark beer instead of the red wine. It's a great option. I've done it with oatmeal stouts, which is a nice, dark, very earthy, beer. You could do like a coffee stout because then it's going to be like a coffee, braised short ribs or braised chuck roast. So those are some different options. There's always different things you can do and mix it up a little. Yes, ma'am.
Can I ask so many questions?
No, you are totally okay. It's a lot more talk in this class, so that's fine.
How large of a chuck roast would you use instead of 6 short ribs?
Um,
How big is that?
I guess it depends on weight. Maybe like, once again, 3 to 4 pounds. You know, with all those things, you're going to lose a lot once it cooks. It's going to shrink down. You know, some fat's going to come off of it. But yeah, I guess you could do whatever you want to fit in there. I guess if you want to feed more people with more protein, you can use a bigger roast. You just need to keep in mind the cooking times are always going to change.
Right,
So.
I just wondered how much 6 short ribs weighs. I mean, I've never cooked short ribs.
It's probably about the same, probably about like 5 pounds maybe, depending on how big they are. So, but that's like, that's if they're bone in. So if they're bone in, they're gonna be a little heavier in weight, which that's still fine to cook with. Just make sure, you know, you remove the bones or, you know. But yeah, I cooked my chuck roast, my pot roast, just till, I follow the instructions pretty much. Like I said, it varies in time sometimes. So after 5 hours or 6 hours, I'll check it with a fork and a knife. If it's pull apart tender, then it's ready to go for me. So, and then lastly, if anyone, are you guys all okay with this? No more questions on that? So since I wasn't super hands-on on showing you things, that's why I included more recipes this time. But I also included a take-home freezer meal. So the honey garlic chicken is also the second to last page. That's going to be the instructions and the recipe content for the take-home meal. So I'll get those out in a minute and start handing them out. But I made a single serving for everyone. It's going to be 1 5-ounce chicken breast, some red skin potatoes, some carrots, some rutabaga, some turnip, some celery root, and then the marinade. So I kept it with a chicken breast, a starch, and then some root vegetables with a nice honey garlic glaze. So like Becky suggested, it's not always like the best idea to throw it in frozen, but you can. There's nothing wrong with it. It just said, you know, sometimes, you know, root vegetables take longer to cook and sometimes chicken breasts take longer to cook. So that's why I incorporated those 2 things in this freezer meal. So you can throw it all in the pot, just follow the instructions I have there. If you want, let me see if I wrote it in here. I did not, but if you wanted, once it's fully cooked and the internal temperature is 165, you can pull it out and even toss it under the broiler for a minute or 2 and get a nice little dark coloring on the chicken breast and a little roast on the vegetables. You don't have to by any means, but just if you want to go that extra step, you can do that. So, okay. I don't know if anyone else had any other questions about that. Otherwise, I'm going to get those out. And if you have any questions for Becky or I, you can feel free to ask, I guess. So I guess that's it.